Eleanor Whitmore had lived in the village of Ashbourne Hollow for all of her 28 years, and in that time, she had learned to expect very little kindness from the people around her. She woke each morning in the same small house her father had left her, made her tea, and looked out at her garden before the village even began to stir. The garden was the one place where she felt truly at ease, where the rows of herbs and flowers did not judge her for being unmarried, for being plain, for being exactly as she was. The village had a great many opinions about Eleanor, and almost none of them were kind. The women who gathered at the market square called her the Spinster, sometimes with pity in their voices, and sometimes with something closer to scorn. She had grown used to the sound of her own name, followed by a soft, knowing laugh, the kind that did not need explaining. She was 28, an age the village considered well past the time a woman should have found a husband, and she carried that fact the way she carried her empty basket to market each week, without complaint, without apology. It had not always been this way. When she was 25, Eleanor had been engaged to a young merchant's son named Thomas Reed. He had courted her for nearly a year, bringing her small gifts and walking with her along the river on Sunday afternoons. The village had nodded approvingly, certain that Eleanor would soon be settled and respectable like every other woman her age. But 3 months before their wedding, Thomas had broken the engagement, choosing instead to marry a young woman from a neighboring town who came with a far larger dowry and a much prettier face. Eleanor had said nothing about it then, and she said nothing about it now, though everyone in Ashbourne Hollow still remembered, and many still whispered about it when they thought she could not hear. What the village never seemed to notice was the quiet strength behind Eleanor's plain dresses and her unfashionable hair. She had taught herself to read Latin from her late father's collection of old books, working through the grammar alone at her kitchen table by candlelight. She understood the names and properties of nearly every plant in her garden, knowledge she had gathered slowly over years of careful study, and the village healer often came to her for advice on tinctures and remedies. She read the newspapers that arrived in the village, even the political columns that most women were not expected to care about, and she had opinions about trade and farming and the affairs of the country that she rarely shared, because she had learned no one cared to hear them from a woman like her. On a gray afternoon in early autumn, the rain falling steadily over Ashbourne Hollow, Eleanor walked home from the apothecary with her basket held close against the weather. As she came to the crossroads at the edge of the village, she saw a fine carriage stopped at an awkward angle, one wheel sunk into the mud and clearly broken. A driver stood beside it, cursing under his breath as he tried to force the wheel back into place, and a tall man in a dark wool coat stood a few feet away, watching with obvious frustration. Eleanor did not recognize the man, though something about the quality of his coat and the polish of his boots suggested he was not from the village. She set her basket down without a word, walked to the hedgerow, and broke off a thick, sturdy branch. She showed the driver exactly how to wedge it beneath the carriage axle, to hold the wheel steady enough to limp the rest of the way to the village smithy. The driver thanked her with evident relief, and the tall man studied her with an expression of open curiosity. "You seem to know a great deal about carriages, for a village woman," he said. "I know a great deal about many things people do not expect me to know," Eleanor answered simply. She picked up her basket and continued on her way home, leaving the stranger standing in the rain. The stranger, as it turned out, was Edmund Ashworth, the Duke of Campshire, a man who had spent the better part of his adult years restoring his family's estate after his father had left it deeply in debt. He had little patience left for the London social season, for the endless balls where young women were paraded before him like prized livestock, each one taught to laugh at his jokes and admire his title, rather than know anything real about him. He had grown weary of the performance long ago, though duty required him to keep attending such events in search of a suitable wife. He found, much to his own surprise, that he could not stop thinking about the woman who had fixed his carriage wheel with nothing but a branch and a calm, unbothered manner. His carriage required several days of repair at the village smithy, and so he remained at the only inn Ashbourne Hollow offered, using the time to make quiet inquiries about the woman he had met at the crossroads. He learned her name was Eleanor Whitmore. He learned, too, the unkind things the villagers said about her, the casual cruelty with which they dismissed her as plain and unwanted. He found himself oddly angry on her behalf, an anger he could not entirely explain to himself, given that he had spoken to her only once, and for less than a minute. Edmund sought her out again 2 days later. He found her in her garden, kneeling in the damp soil with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, carefully separating the roots of some plant he did not recognize. She did not rise immediately when she noticed him standing at the gate, finishing her work first, before standing and brushing the dirt from her hands. "Your Grace," she said, for she had since learned who he was, "I did not expect to see you again. I find I had questions I could not quite let go of," Edmund admitted, stepping closer. "You said you know things people do not expect. I find myself curious what else you know." What followed was a conversation that stretched well into the afternoon, the kind of conversation Edmund could not remember having in years. Eleanor spoke of her father's old Latin texts and the botanical names she had taught herself to recognize. She spoke of newspaper reports from the continent, of new methods of crop rotation being debated among landowners, and when Edmund offered his own opinion on the matter, she disagreed with him plainly and argued her point for nearly 20 minutes before finally conceding, with good humor, that his argument was the stronger one. Edmund left her garden that evening with an unsettling realization. He had enjoyed that single argument about crop rotation more than he had enjoyed an entire decade of London ballrooms. He returned the following day, and the day after that, finding small excuses each time. A book he thought she might enjoy, a question about a plant in his own estate's gardens, anything that might bring him back to her gate. The village began to notice his visits, and the whispers shifted in shape without losing any of their cruelty. Surely the Duke was simply amusing himself with the pitiable spinster. Surely he would grow bored soon enough, and return to London, where prettier, more proper women waited for a man of his standing. Eleanor heard these whispers too, carried to her through the careless words of shopkeepers and neighbors who did not think she was listening. She said nothing of it to Edmund. She had learned long ago not to expect kindness from the people around her, and she refused to let herself hope that his attention meant anything more than a passing curiosity from a bored nobleman. But Edmund's visits did not stop. He brought her books from his own library at Camshire, volumes he thought she might not have access to in such a small village. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, asking questions, and remembering her answers in a way no man had ever done for her before. He noticed the small things about her, the way she hummed quietly while working among her herbs, the gentle patience she showed her aging aunt, the steady dignity with which she carried herself, despite years of the village's quiet unkindness. One evening, as the last of the autumn leaves fell from the trees and the air turned sharp with the coming winter, Edmund found Eleanor sitting alone beside her window, a single candle lighting the pages of her book. He had come with some small excuse about returning a borrowed volume, but the moment she looked up and met his eyes, the excuse fell away entirely, forgotten. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice steadier than he expected it to be, "I must tell you something, and I would ask that you hear me fully before you answer." Eleanor closed her book slowly, her expression carefully composed, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "I have spent the greater part of my adult life surrounded by people who wanted something from my title or my fortune," Edmund continued. I had grown so used to that emptiness that I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to be valued simply for who I am, rather than for what I possess. You have never once asked me about my estate, or my income, or my place in society. You have argued with me about crop rotation. You have corrected my Latin without the slightest hesitation. You have told me plainly when you believed I was wrong. I have never in my life felt more respected by another person. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, but she said nothing, waiting. I do not offer you my hand out of pity, Edmund said. Though I confess the cruelty this village has shown you angers me more than I can properly express. I offer you my hand because in the whole of my life, I have never met a mind I admired more, or a heart I trusted as completely as I trust yours. I am asking you, Eleanor, to be my wife. For a long moment, Eleanor could not find any words at all. She had closed the door on such hopes years ago, had told herself firmly that a quiet, useful life was enough, that she did not need the things other women seemed to have so easily. But here, in her small sitting room, stood a duke, looking at her not with pity or idle curiosity, but with something that looked remarkably like love. You understand, she finally said, choosing her words with care, that the village will say you have lost your senses. They will say you could have any woman in England, and instead, you have chosen the plain spinster who reads too much and smiles too little. Then the village will be wrong on every count, Edmund replied gently. You are not plain to me, Eleanor. You have simply never smiled for people who did not deserve to see it. A real laugh escaped her then, startled out of her by the simple truth in his words, a sound she had not made freely in years. Yes, she said, I will marry you. The news spread through Ashbourne Hollow, faster than any fire could have traveled. The Duke whose carriage had broken at the crossroads was to marry Eleanor Whitmore, the very woman the village had mocked for a decade, as too plain and too old to ever find a husband. Where once there had been whispers of pity and scorn, there were now whispers of astonishment, and more than a few villagers who had once turned away from Eleanor in the market square now found themselves eager to claim a long and warm friendship with her. Eleanor noticed the change, of course. She had never been foolish, and she saw clearly how quickly people's opinions could shift once a title was involved. But she found, to her own quiet surprise, that she no longer needed their approval. She had spent years building a life of dignity without their kindness, and she would not now bend herself into something smaller simply to earn it after the fact. The wedding took place in early winter, inside the small stone church where Eleanor had been christened and confirmed, and where she had quietly been mourned for years, as a woman who would never have a family of her own. The church filled with villagers who had once looked away from her without a second thought, now craning their necks for a glimpse of the Duke's bride. Eleanor wore a simple gown, nothing so grand as London fashion might have demanded, and those who watched her walk down the aisle agreed, quietly among themselves, that she had never looked more at peace. As Edmund slid the ring onto her finger, he leaned close and whispered words meant only for her, that he would have married her in her gardening clothes, with dirt still beneath her fingernails, that she had never needed any finery to be the only woman he had ever truly wanted. Eleanor smiled then, the same private smile she had once reserved only for her books and her herbs, now given freely and without hesitation to the man who had finally seen her, truly seen her, when no one else in her life had bothered to look closely enough. They left Ashbourne Hollow together that winter, bound for Campshire, where Eleanor would take her place as Duchess. She brought with her none of the jewels or fine gowns a bride of such standing might be expected to carry, for she possessed none. Instead, she brought her father's old Latin texts, careful cuttings and seeds from her beloved garden, and the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had finally been valued for exactly who she had always been. In the years that followed, Eleanor became known throughout Campshire not simply as the Duke's wife, but as a woman of remarkable knowledge and quiet authority in her own right. She expanded the estate's gardens, introducing remedies and herbs she had studied since childhood, and she corresponded with scholars about botany and history, exchanges Edmund encouraged rather than discouraged. The servants at Campshire quickly came to respect her, not because of her title, but because she treated each of them with the same patient dignity she had once shown her aging aunt back in Ashbourne Hollow. The village of Ashbourne Hollow long remembered the story of the plain spinster who became a duchess, though the telling of it changed a great deal over the years, smoothed and softened, until it sounded almost like a fairy tale, a stroke of impossible luck that had simply fallen into Eleanor's lap. But those who had truly known her, who had watched her tend her garden alone through years of quiet unkindness, understood the truth of it far better than any storyteller could capture. Eleanor Whitmore had not been transformed by the Duke's proposal, nor had luck alone carried her from a small cottage to a grand estate. She had simply, after years of being overlooked, finally been seen by someone capable of recognizing what had always been there: a sharp mind, a steady heart, and a quiet strength that no amount of village gossip had ever managed to diminish. The Duke had not rescued her from her plain and lonely life, not truly. He had simply been wise enough to recognize her worth, when so many others before him had not.